Well, welcome to Chapter 12, Compensating the Flexible Workforce. Now, at the end of last week's lecture, I indicated that this week we would look at a relatively new compensation issue, and that's correct. Up until this point, we had been largely talking about comp and benefits for full-time or regular employees, those who are formally employed by the company. But in recent years, there have been several new employee categories that have appeared to compound pay and benefit issues. The workplace has changed much in recent years, making the use of other types of employees a positive force in any organization's quest for success. On the other side of the coin, much has changed in society and families since I was a boy. Imagine that. And these changes have made other types of employment attractive to employees. Flexibility in schedule has enabled some people to work when other obligations would have prevented that. And alternative forms of employment have also enabled individuals to hold more than one job. So in addition to complicating the workplace, these changes have benefited both employees and employers. Employees and employers have successfully adapted to the societal changes that came about rather quickly. But to pretend that the societal changes themselves have been all positive is to ignore the unintended consequences experienced by families, the economy, businesses, etc. Now, this is not a sociology class, so we won't delve deeply into the unintended consequences. But you should be aware that even though businesses and employees have adapted to economic and societal changes, the adaptations may actually enable other problems that we currently live with. What problems? Well, we'll talk a little bit about those in this lecture. The first sentence in this chapter states, quote, "Changing business conditions and personal preferences for work-life balance have led to an increase in contingent workers and the use of flexible work schedules in the United States," end quote. This sentence says a lot and also includes a fair amount of controversy. Certainly business conditions have changed, but I question if personal preferences caused the business change or the other way around. Regardless, both changes caused a drive towards alternative work arrangements. So what are the personal preferences and what are the business changes? Now, when I was a boy, my mother stayed home with us kids while my dad worked. He was a full-time employee, 40 hours a week. He held a skilled job and made decent money. We were not rich by any stretch of the imagination, but he earned enough, barely, to pay the bills and put food on the table. There wasn't a lot of extra money, but a lot of extra money wasn't needed. There were no iPads or computers or video games or other extras to be purchased. They weren't even around. As I'm sure you've heard before, times were simple then. Now, my family was not an exception. Everyone around us lived the same simple life in the same simple way. We were normal. Men worked outside the home and women stayed home with the children. Now, you can make all the value judgments you want, but that's the way it was, and it worked. It provided a certain stability to life, and particularly to the life of kids. Now, most jobs were full-time jobs and were highly structured. Business hours, even retail, were restricted, and believe it or not, most businesses were closed on Sunday and sometimes Saturday as well. But as the text states, business conditions changed. Conditions in society changed too. Society valued more material things, which eventually became needs, and it took more income to purchase these family needs. Women started to leave the home and go to work. Men started working 2 jobs. Kids started staying home by themselves more often. Families changed to meet the additional financial needs. As consumer demand increased for a whole host of products and services, business hours expanded. More businesses were open late at night, and more were open on Sunday. As people needed more money to purchase more things, multi-income families became the norm. I'm trying not to get into judgment of these changes, but merely point out that dramatic changes took place. I don't know what changed first, business or families, but they both change quickly, and the changes continue today. The message is clear. Business changes lead to family and societal changes, and family and societal changes lead to business changes. I can see it graphically because I lived it. It may be a little more obscure to some of you because you didn't experience those changes firsthand. Ultimately, these changes led to a need for more flexibility in the workplace. More flexibility was needed because it was more difficult to balance home time and work time. We can say that the changes emanated from personal preference, as implied in the text, but I would argue that eventually, on an individual level, it became almost a requirement. Families needed more flexibility to meet the increasing financial burden experienced in everyday life. And it is easy to question if these so-called personal preferences led to better work-life balance. Some may argue that the result was really more work and less work-life balance, but nevertheless, the authors are correct. Changing business conditions and society values combined to drive the search for alternative employment arrangements to meet the new needs of workers and their families. And our topic of discussion today is the resulting answer to that need for further flexibility. And make no mistake, businesses needed additional flexibility too. The good thing is that the creative solutions to the flexibility issues experienced by both business and families provided more opportunities for greater income. The bad news is that it provided those opportunities by sacrificing family time and requiring more hours at work and away from home. Women were leaving the home and joining the workforce either part-time or full-time. Men were working more and more hours and working additional jobs. Business was experiencing new increased demand for products and services which required additional employees to work during non-traditional hours. You could say that the additional business needs were met through the use of contingent workers by part-time, temporary, or leased employees, and using more contractors and consultants. Employees' needs for more flexibility were met by flexible work schedules and part-time and temporary work opportunities. And these adaptations allowed both employees and employers to increase income and prosper. So, there's a real positive aspect to this adaptation, but there's also a cost. Families are less stable, kids are less supervised, and on and on. But before we get too skeptical about the outcomes, the changes continue. At least some of us find ourselves spending more and more time at home. We now find ourselves working from home. We find mothers and fathers returning home, but this time to work from the home office. I'm an example of that. You're an example too. You find yourself spending less time in the classroom and more time at home doing classwork. We find kids still staying at home, sometimes by themselves, but at least parents are home more often working in a different room. And we find the kids doing different things when they are in the home. Our lifestyle has driven members of the family further apart, even when they are in the home together. And well, you get the idea. Things continue to change. Where's it going? Well, where do you think it will end? I bring this up to give you some background as to how we have evolved to these different work arrangements. Let me be a bit more cynical in my interpretation. The above changes have created more freedom for women and less supervision for kids. The changes created greater variety and opportunity for men, but much less structure and certainty in the workplace. The changes allowed more income and the ability to purchase more convenience for families and less family stability. Nothing is all good or all bad. But anyone who thinks business conditions or changes in business conditions don't impact multiple aspects of our society is hiding from the truth. To be sure, I have simplified all of the historical changes mentioned above and have detailed them from my own personal experience, but I have not simplified the fact that business conditions change society and society in turn changes business conditions. And nothing exemplifies that relationship better than the changing work arrangements discussed in this chapter. And how quickly did this change happen? Let me use the example of the use of temporary employees. I started using temporary employees in the mid-1980s. At the time, it was a relatively new concept. I used them sparingly to cover absences and for a few special projects. The quality of temporary employees was not good, but for simple, unskilled tasks, they were acceptable. As the organization became more comfortable with temporary employees, the usage and demand for such employees increased. And there were only a few companies providing temporary workers. And those companies were located in larger metropolitan areas. In other words, the contingency employment industry was in its infancy. In the late 1980s, I worked for an organization that used a large number of temporary employees. Temporary employees were a part of the fabric of that organization. We used those employees to cover absences, vacations, special projects, and to cover large temporary changes in product demand. In this last instance, they were used to provide stability to the full-time workforce. We had no layoffs as we could staff for an average level of demand and cover high demand with temporary employees. During times of low or moderate demand, temporary employees were not used. It worked very well, and I suspect that is how most organizations use contingent workers today. Of course, one of the many issues highlighted by this chapter revolves around who actually is responsible for contingent workers. Who's the employer? Is it the company who uses the employee's skills, talent, and labor? Or is it the company who actually employs the individual and in turn provides those skills, talents, and labor to the entity that needs them? I won't go into the aspects of an employer's status since the text spends much time on that discussion and does a pretty good job of the details. Although it sounds complicated, it's really pretty straightforward. Government regulations and rules highlight what criteria determines employer and contractor status. Organizations must be cognizant of the requirements and meet them as appropriate. However, I would like to spend some time on flexible work schedules and challenges presented by this new adaptation. Such schedule changes meet important employee needs, but present new challenges to management. In the end, it is great to provide employees a mechanism to better meet their family needs, but the work still must be done. The hours still must be covered in a productive way. Using flex time schedules, employees can schedule the work time between specific hours. For example, if a retail establishment or an office opens at 8 a.m. until 8 p.m., the employee can choose to work from 10 a.m. to miss the rush hour traffic until 6:30 p.m. Or they may choose to work from 8 a.m. until 4:30 p.m. But who covers until 8 p.m.? Or who fights the rush hour traffic to get to work at 8 a.m. if you need more than one person at that time of day? These are certainly issues that can be overcome, but they are issues that must be reckoned with nonetheless. I've established a compressed work week schedule in manufacturing facilities. Employees wanted to work 4 10-hour days, Monday through Friday, and enjoy a 3-day weekend each week. I and others had major concerns about 10-hour workdays. Our fear was that 10 hours of work was a long time in our work environment and fatigue could set in and the accident rate could increase. We compromised somewhat and instituted 4 9-hour days and 1 4-hour day. Employees enjoyed a 2.5-day weekend each week. By the way, employees understood our fears of 10-hour work days and were thrilled with the 4.5-day work week we settled on. But issues such as safety and quality are legitimate concerns. Telecommuting brings up a whole new host of issues that may not be readily apparent. If employees are working from home, are they working on their own computers or from company-owned computers? Who owns the work produced on the computer if that computer belongs to the employee? How does the organization protect customer and other confidential data if it is in the hands of the employee? How does the organization protect from computer viruses and from external hacking of computers on a home network. If an employee falls at home and gets hurt while working, is it covered under workers' compensation? How do you know the employee is working? How does an organization know that an employee is contributing a full day work if they're at home? How does the manager supervise the employees at work? How do you keep employees engaged in the company if they're never on site? Again, these are not insurmountable problems, but they are problems that must be addressed, or they could evolve into major liability issues. Bottom line is that flexible schedules make managing more difficult, but they can also create a much more satisfied group of employees. And they can create a very significant competitive advantage in the labor market, enabling employers to attract a much higher caliber of employee. And better employees make managing much easier. Nothing is all bad or all good. Another issue contingent workforce and flexible schedules create is a concern for company strategy, values, and mission. We have discussed company strategy, values, and mission throughout this semester. Those discussions have centered on the importance of employee commitment at all levels of the organization. Can temporary employees commit to the organization's strategies, values, and mission? Do they even know the strategy, values, and mission? I'm not necessarily talking about part-time employees, since they are owned by the company. I'm talking about employees who are owned by another company. And I ask these questions as someone who has used extensively contingent workers. But suffice it to say, one downside of contingent or temporary workers is that they are temporary and they know it. Their commitment and long-term interests are likely elsewhere. Work at our company is a, quote, stopover to someplace else. Employees involved in flexible work schedules and telecommuting may also find it difficult to experience full commitment to company strategies, values, and missions. They are employees of the company and do have a vested interest in seeing the company's strategy and mission succeed and values upheld. But there is a physical disconnect that can influence the level of commitment. Flexible work schedules and telecommuting are new to the workplace and bring many competitive advantages, but they also bring many challenges. However, both work arrangements are here to stay, and both are likely to proliferate rapidly in coming years. As organizations try to meet employee and market demands, flexibility is a new and prominent tool. Flexibility requires change, and change is always difficult. But change we must, or compete we cannot. It's an exciting time in business these days.